So 1948, which is a few years after the war, um, Stalin has been able to establish some communist governments in Eastern Europe. This looks to the West like communism is really starting to spread. This real fear that communism is just going to go further and further and further unless it's stopped. Another element of this tension is the US has atomic weapons now. And this has to factor into any negotiations or tensions because of the catastrophic power and destruction that can be caused by these weapons. Because the Soviet Union is afraid of this, they create their own. So now we have these two countries with atomic weapons with opposite perspectives on how the world should run. This phrase, the Iron Curtain, it's used all the time when we talk about the Cold War. It was created by Winston Churchill, my best friend. If you'll remember, in summer of 1945, with the new elections in Britain, Churchill was not re-elected to Parliament and was no longer Prime Minister. So he began a speaking tour, talking to, especially in America, and he was talking about some of the tensions in Europe. And he gives this phrase in a small town in Missouri, and he talks about how an iron curtain has descended from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. That all of these territories that had been under Nazi rule, that the Allies had fought to free from Nazi rule, are now under communist rule. And so we've swapped one dictator for another, and this curtain, it's not an actual curtain, it's a metaphor, that his iron grip over these territories is in conflict with what the West stands for. It's because Stalin is very aggressive. Now here we have some American propaganda, but this was really the fear that communism was going to spread, that it was going to take hold of all of these different places. And Stalin really didn't like the West either. He thought that capitalism was evil, it would lead to war, and he wants those atomic weapons at any cost. So there's this man named George Kennan, and he's a diplomat. He had worked in Moscow for quite a while, and he was advising the American president, President Truman, and in seeing what was going on in Soviet Russia, and seeing how the government speaks of the West and of these other territories, in 1946, 47, Kennan sends a telegram, a 16-page telegram to President Truman. Now, the thing is, why would you send a 16-page telegram? Why not send a letter? Well, it's a lot harder to intercept a telegram rather than a letter. And the phrase that comes out of this letter is containment, is what Kennan suggests as a seasoned diplomat seeing what Russia's goals are. He says, this threat must be contained. Otherwise, it will be like a series of dominoes, that if one country falls to communism, then the next one will fall, and the next one will fall. So we have to contain this threat now. America approaches post-war Europe, sort of with a unicorn, but not really. They want to encourage democracy. They want to encourage capitalism. Because they truly believe that this is the most effective way to accomplish anything. One way we see this happen is with President Truman in Greece and Turkey. Britain had been involved in Greece and Turkey, and as we know, Britain sort of bows out of international politics at the end of World War II for a bit. And they ask America, will you step in Greece and Turkey and help support them? So this is called the Truman Doctrine. The United States goes in and gives aid, military and financial aid to Greece and Turkey because they were afraid that those countries would be susceptible to communism. So this is how America is encouraging democracy, encouraging capitalism. It's actually successful. These countries are able to sort of rebuild a bit and do not become communist. So it seems like this system works. the Truman Doctrine works, it will be expanded into the Marshall Plan. It's also known as the European Recovery Plan. So it's named after the Secretary of State, Marshall. And this is taking this idea of the Truman Doctrine of giving financial aid to these countries in order to prevent them from becoming communist. It's because in war-torn Europe, if you think about how much Europe suffered in World War II, how much rebuilding they have to do, it would have been very, very enticing to have this system come in and say, so have you heard of communism? You know, the Soviets will come in and we will rebuild for you. We will set it all up and you will be good to go. This would mean they'd become communist. America says, we're going to help you. You're going to do it yourself, and we're going to help you do it. But if you do it yourself, it'll be stronger, it will last longer. And if you look at how much money is given to each of these countries, to France and Britain and Italy and Western Germany, it's because they were the most war-torn. They were the most susceptible to communism, because the communist parties had already been in these countries for a number of years. Now the threat is real. And so you'll see these signs all throughout Europe saying, you know, this building rebuilt by the taxpayers of America to get Europe back on its feet again, to get it started back into, you know, a normal way of life. And this is paid for by the American taxpayers. This is how real this threat of communism seems. The United Nations was first, the phrase was first used in its present sense by FDR, by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, during World War II. And he used it in reference to the Allied nations, talking about these United Nations and the fight that we're in together. And that term was borrowed even when the war is over. And the organization as we know it was created pretty soon after the war, October 1945. It is created, it's 50 countries, and if you want a quick overview, there is a video here in Canvas that you can watch. But the goal of the United Nations first is to replace the League of Nations. We know that the League of Nations failed with this idea of collective security. We talked about this in the last unit, that it was doomed to fail for a number of reasons. The United Nations is not about collective security, but really, in general, it's about world peace. How do we maintain peace rather than worrying about how we're going to fight or who we're going to fight? And this is the logo, this is the flag of the United Nations. Light blue is usually seen as a very peaceful color. You can see the world. We have sort of bird's eye view of the world, the longitude and latitude lines. And then surrounded by the olive branches, the universal symbol for peace. Now, there are three main bodies, or three main parts of the United Nations. The first part is the Security Council. The job of the Security Council is to deal with issues of international security, potential causes or potential places where there might be a fight or there might be an outbreak of a war. So this is sort of the elite group. There are 15 members on the Security Council, and the UN's location, or the UN's headquarters, I should say, are in New York City. Now, it was built in New York City rather than London or Paris or Berlin, because remember, right after World War II, those countries needed to rebuild. America was never attacked directly other than Pearl Harbor. So it made sense to build this organization in New York City. There are 15 members on the Security Council, 5 permanent members and 10 rotating members. So what that means is there are 5 countries who always have a spot at this table. France, Great Britain, China, Russia, and the United States. Because at the end of World War II, those were the most prominent nations in the world. You don't have Germany because of that whole Nazi thing. We just finished fighting the Germans, so we're not going to give them sort of any special benefits, even though today Germany is incredibly powerful. The 10 members have 2-year terms. They rotate out. And so if they are voting on something, let's say hypothetically there is an issue in Ukraine, and the Security Council would like to vote that no one be allowed to interfere with Ukraine. Well, because Russia, or at the time the Soviet Union, is one of the 5 permanent members, they have veto power. So any one of the 5 permanent members can veto the others. So that makes it very difficult to accomplish things, especially in issues that are very contentious or high tension. The second part of the United Nations is the General Assembly. This is like the Congress or the Parliament. This is the part that everybody can belong to. It's not the elite, it's everyone. And both the General Assembly and the Security Council can create resolutions or sort of international laws, hopefully. There are 193 members in the United Nations as a whole, and governments will appoint ambassadors to the United Nations, and they'll all come sit here, and you'll see them wearing different earpieces because of all the different languages that are spoken. And this is the stage where if a world leader really wants to make a statement or make a speech to the whole world, they will come here to the United Nations to do it. One of the most important things that they did at the beginning of the United Nations was the creation of the Declaration of Human Rights. And a lot of this is in response to some of the issues from the Second World War, that you can't restrict the movement of people, that genocide is not good, that torture should not be allowed. And so the idea is, with these countries that agree to join the United Nations, that they will adhere to these issues on human rights. However, let's say, for instance, North Korea. North Korea has these horrible prison camps, and North Korea is part of the United Nations. So if the General Assembly says, North Korea, you are violating human rights, what can the United Nations do about it? If the goal is world peace, the goal is to avoid fighting, the only thing the United Nations can really do is say, don't do that. They don't have a whole lot of power other than to say, no, that's bad, don't do that.